welcome to Lesson 5 of GCSE Elizabeth I lessons. Today you are going to need to be on page 18 of your lesson notes booklet for Lesson 5, which focuses on the Elizabethan religious settlement. Now, it's important to say before we get started, and this image in front of you here, which you've also got in your lesson notes booklet, is particularly important, is to see how much the church did in fact change in its physical appearance as a result of the Elizabethan religious settlement. So when we look at the settlement in a moment and we look at the features of it, when we look to see what Elizabeth did to try and settle this difficult issue of religion in England, had been created by her father and then was carried on by her brother Edward and her sister Mary. When she created this settlement which changed the church and it's called the Elizabethan religious settlement, it's supposed to settle the issue between Catholics and Protestants, and it's supposed to fix that issue. You can see how much the church changed. The image at the top is what a Catholic church looked like. The image at the bottom is what a Protestant Church of England church looked like after the Elizabethan religious settlement. Now, this is quite a significant change in the lives of ordinary parishioners who would go to a church on a Sunday. Look at how different the church appears. And given that people were very proud of their local churches and liked to decorate them and liked to have the ornaments on display, you can see how much of a change this would have been for ordinary parishioners, ordinary people who went to church in 1558, to see how their church had changed by 1559 following the Elizabethan religious settlement. Now, if we think back to lesson 3, when we were thinking about the problem of religion, and we were looking at how the Tudors had been on this religious roller coaster from Catholic to Protestant, and then Catholic, and then Protestant again, we are reminded of how much religious turmoil there had been in the country. And Elizabeth's job was to try and settle this. Her religious settlement is supposed to settle the issue, to put it to bed, to fix the problem. And it was an incredibly vexed problem, because some people in the country were Catholic and some people in the country were Protestant, and Elizabeth had to find a way of keeping both of those groups of people happy. Now, the people who were extremely Protestant, who were very Protestant, they were called Puritans, and in a moment you're going to read, you can see the image here from the textbook, which is also in your notes booklet. You're going to read about Puritan views, and you're also going to read about what Catholics thought about the settlement, and you're going to read about the settlement itself. So in a moment you're going to read this page and the following page that's in your notes booklet, and you're going to think about the key features of the settlement. What was Elizabeth doing to try and balance out things that Catholics would be happy with or unhappy with, and things that Puritans would be happy with or unhappy with? So this is the time to pause, read that information, and think about the features of the settlement. Okay, one of the things that you should have seen and noted when you were reading there was the Act of Uniformity, about the uniformity of the church service that was put in place as a result of the Elizabethan religious settlement. And that Act of Uniformity referred to communion, the taking of bread and wine during the service. Now, this was particularly vague. This is one of the ways that Elizabeth tried to steer a middle ground to try and keep Puritans, Protestants happy on one hand and Catholics on the other. It was particularly vague as to whether or not this bread and wine actually was just bread and wine that symbolized Jesus' body and symbolized Jesus' blood, or whether it had actually transformed into Jesus' body and blood, which is what Catholics believe. So the religious settlement was a way of trying to steer a middle course between Catholic and Puritan beliefs. Yes, it was a Protestant settlement, but also it had some vagueness to it, so that Catholics could deal with it, and Catholics could could still go to these church services without feeling as though they were totally abandoning their religious beliefs. We can see here that the three key elements, the three key features of that religious settlement: the Act of Uniformity that I've just referred to, that established what churches should look like and what services should look like; the Act of Supremacy, which made Elizabeth supreme head of the church; and royal injunctions, a set of instructions that were put in place to make sure that the Act of Supremacy and Act of Uniformity were enforced. It also included instructions on how people should worship God and the structure of services, etc. Okay, in your booklet you should now find this answer to describe the two features of Elizabethan religious settlement. This is a 4 out of 4 answer. I want you to have a look at this answer. It's very simple but very clear and very focused on the question. It picks a feature, identifies it, explains it. Picks a feature, identifies it, explains it. There's a task in your booklet that asks you to describe one further feature. So identify a further feature of the religious settlement and then explain it. So if you pause this and have a go at that now. Okay, so you should have identified a further feature. You could have talked about the royal injunctions. You could have talked about the way in which the Act of Uniformity was enforced. You could have talked about the way in which visitations took place to make sure that people were following the dictates of the religious settlement. But you should have a good sense of what that settlement was all about and how the Elizabethan church was controlled, and the way in which church services and the whole of the church hierarchy was organised by the religious settlement, and the way in which that religious settlement was enforced. What you are now going to move on to look at is how people responded to this. What was the response to the Elizabethan religious settlement? How did people feel about it? How did the clergy respond? That's the priests and the bishops. How did ordinary people respond? You're going to, in a moment, watch this little clip. You find the link to that in your notes booklet, and Professor Starkey in this clip is going to talk about the way in which Elizabeth was trying to steer this middle ground between Catholics and Puritans, but also the way in which she was trying not to make martyrs out of Catholics. So she was trying to make people outwardly conform to the rules, make sure the Act of Uniformity was enforced, make sure people went along to church and did what they were supposed to do, but what they did in the privacy of their own homes, or what they believed, she wasn't really that bothered about. She once famously said, do not wish to make a window into men's souls. I'm not interested in what you think and what you believe in your own heart, in your own head. I just want you to go along with what it is that the main guidelines of the religious settlement put in place. So you're going to watch that video clip. You're then going to find that there are two more excerpts from the textbook that you need to have a look at to see the way in which the settlement was enforced, the way in which ordinary people responded, the way in which the settlement was received by the people. And there are 3 questions to answer after you've looked at the clip and read the information. So the time's coming now to pause, watch the clip, read the information, and then answer the 3 questions underneath. Okay, so you should have got from that task the sense in which the bishops, a lot of them whom were Catholic, and Starkey mentioned them in his video clip, they did not particularly go along with the religious settlement. 27 out of 28 of them resigned, didn't want to be part of the church anymore because of the fact that they couldn't accept the church services and the structure of the church the way it was. And that contrasted with the ordinary people, the vast majority of whom just kind of went along with the settlement, just even if they were not particularly Protestant, they went through the motions. There's only a few recusants who were Catholics who refused to go to church services, and Elizabeth enforced this with some visitations to check up on various different parishes and different churches to check that things were being done the way she wanted them done. So what we're now going to move on to is the last section of this lesson is to think about people who weren't that happy with the settlement, people who challenged it. You'll see you've got two excerpts from the textbook. You've got one which is the one in front of you here, the nature and extent of the Puritan challenge. So remember, the Puritans are extreme Protestants. They're very Protestant, and they want the church to be as Protestant as possible. And then you've got this excerpt from the textbook, which looks at the challenge from Catholics. So you've got Puritans on the one hand, who didn't like the settlement in some ways, and Catholics on the other, who didn't like the settlement in some ways. And remember that Elizabeth's trying to drive a middle course between those people. So you're going to have a look at the threat posed by Puritans and the threat posed by Catholics. And you're going to think about the nature of the threat from either side. You'll see in your lesson notes booklet, once you've read the two excerpts from the textbook, that in order to help you organise your notes on the Puritan threat and the Catholic threat to the settlement, that there is a little table for you to fill in, which has the Puritan threat on the left-hand side, and it has the Catholic threat on the right-hand side. And in a moment, you're going to pause this, and you're going to fill in that table using the two excerpts from the textbook, and then we'll come back and think about which of the threats was the biggest. Okay, welcome back. You should have filled in your table on the Puritan threat and the Catholic threat. We want to think now, just at the end of this lesson, who posed the biggest threat? Well, probably in 1559 and 1560, the people who posed the biggest threat to the Elizabethan religious settlement were in fact Puritans. People who were pushing for the settlement to be as Protestant as possible. The reason they posed the biggest threat is because Elizabeth had to listen to them. If you look at the crucifix controversy that you should have noted down in that table, she had to roll over and change her mind because she couldn't afford to annoy the Puritan bishops, the clergy, too much, because she needed them. Remember, a large number of the Catholic bishops had resigned and didn't want to be part of the church anymore. So if she was actually going to have the right number of church clergy to actually be able to keep the church running, to actually do the jobs that the church needed, then she was going to need to keep these guys on side, and she was going to need to keep them sweet. So she needed to roll over a little bit and do what they wanted on the crucifix controversy. So in that sense, they posed a bigger threat to the settlement in the short term, in the sense that they had the power to kind of scupper this thing before it got started, to stop it from actually functioning on a practical day-to-day level. Now, as we're going to see in 2 or 3 lessons' time, ultimately Catholics were a bigger threat to Elizabeth. But their threat to Elizabeth was not necessarily a threat just to the religious settlement. They obviously wanted to bring Catholicism back, but the Catholic threat was more of a political threat. It was more of a threat linked to foreign affairs, which was a desire amongst some more extreme Catholics to just remove Elizabeth from the throne and to bring Catholicism back. So that's not really necessarily a direct challenge to her, just her religious settlement. That's a challenge to her legitimacy and who she is. That's a challenge to her being queen, and they wanted to remove her. And as we're going to see, as I said, in 2 or 3 lessons' time, when we look at the Northern Rebellion, the Northern Rebellion against Elizabeth was a Catholic rebellion, but actually it was quite a political rebellion. It was about power. It was about wanting to remove Elizabeth and replace her with somebody else who would allow the Catholic nobles to have the power that they had once had. So in the short term, Puritans provided the biggest threat challenge to the religious settlement, although in the longer term, obviously, Catholics provided a bigger threat to Elizabeth in general. And so that brings us to the end of Lesson 5 on the Elizabethan religious settlement. Next time, Lesson 6 focuses on the threat to Elizabeth from abroad. So until then, goodbye, take care, see you for Lesson 6.